Thank you, Brian, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Caterina Brandmayr, and I'm the Director of Policy and Translation at the Grantham Institute at Imperial College. As Brian emphasized in his remarks, with extreme weather events already causing the loss of life and livelihoods across the world, and the window to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees rapidly narrowing as emissions continue to climb, taking action to tackle climate change has never been more pressing. And crucially, as Brian also mentioned, countries gathered in Dubai last December for COP28 reached a historic agreement to accelerate climate action, including with a commitment to an ambitious set of goals to drive forward the energy transition. These included goals to triple global renewable energy capacity and double global energy efficiency improvements by 2030, as well as a commitment to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels. These outcomes from the global stocktake have laid the foundations for a significant acceleration of decarbonization efforts. But the key task now is to ensure that those commitments are translated into real-world implementation and emission reductions. And with countries due to come forward with their next round of national climate plans, known as nationally determined contributions, in the lead up to COP30, it will be important for those plans to set out an ambitious and credible set of measures to roll out clean energy systems and move away from fossil fuels. Delivering these energy transition goals and closing the gap to 1.5-degree pathway will require significant scale-up in action. Current NDCs, as we just saw in the presentation, put us on track for a warming of well beyond 2 degrees. And significantly, on the energy transition, the International Energy Agency finds that current efforts across all headline energy transition commitments fall well short of what is needed. Therefore, in this panel today, we'll take a closer look at what steps are needed to accelerate delivery of this transition and ensure commitments from COP28 are translated into ambitious and credible plans. And we'll take a look at what needs to happen at the national level, but we'll also discuss the ways in which the international community will need to come together to inject momentum in this agenda and build the necessary confidence that finance will flow to support the transition to clean, resilient economies. To discuss this with me, we're joined by a brilliant set of speakers. So to my left is Vivien Foster, who's a Principal Research Fellow in the Center for Environmental Policy at Imperial College. Next to her is Rebecca Kershaw, Business Engagement Lead from the Climate Champions team. Next in line is Harry Boyd-Carpenter, Managing Director for Climate Strategy and Delivery at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And last but not least, Devlin, who is the advisor on methane, fossil fuel phase-out, and just transition in the Directorate General for Energy of the European Commission. We've got a lot of ground to cover over the next 40 minutes or so. So I'm going to ask that the speakers keep their answers to about 2-3 minutes, if we can aim for that. I should say also there will be the chance to take some questions from the audience towards the end of this panel. So please do make a mental note of anything you'd like to ask the speakers. And also a couple of bits of housekeeping. So we're not expecting any fire drills. So if there's a fire alarm, do leave the venue. If you can please put your phones on silent. We are recording this event, and it would be great to keep the quality as high as possible. And also apologies for the sweltering temperatures. We thought we'd give you a bit of a taste of what a warmer climate might bring. Hopefully the AC will kick in, but please do bear with us while we get there. Having said all that, if we kick off the discussion, I thought we'd start by taking a bit of a closer look at what implications the energy transition will have for different countries. And if I may start with you, Vivien, in your work, you've looked at opportunities for delivering the energy transition across a range of low and lower middle income countries. And I'd be keen to sort of hear from you what are some of the main factors that decision makers will have to consider as they develop their energy transition plans. And what does this mean also in terms of tailoring some of the interventions to support those transitions?
Thanks, Caterina. The nature of the energy transition really differs hugely across different types of countries, and those differences are particularly marked in the global south. So we've done some work developing a typology of countries that I'd like to share with you. And I think the most relatively straightforward case is the fossil fuel importers. Countries like Morocco, for example. For them, the energy transition could potentially bring macroeconomic benefits because it would reduce their need to import fossil fuels, which are a major drain on the budget. And it would also reduce their macroeconomic exposure to fossil fuel price shocks, which can be a very major issue. That's not to downplay the magnitude of the challenge. These countries still have to transform their energy systems, but at least there's a certain kind of macroeconomic motivation and an alignment of incentives. Much more difficult is the situation of fossil fuel producing low and middle income countries. Let's take, for example, first of all, countries like India, which are massive producers of fossil fuels, but primarily for their own domestic use. India relies heavily on its own domestic coal. Not only do these countries have to transition their energy systems, but they also need to worry about the equity implications of that transition, thinking about protecting local economies that are very dependent on these industries, dealing with unemployment issues, as well as contending with vested economic interests that they then may lobby against the green transition. Nevertheless, the situation becomes even more complicated if we turn to established fossil fuel exporters. These would be countries like Nigeria, Angola, Algeria, countries that are already major exporters of oil and gas. They not only have to transition their energy systems and worry about just transition, but in addition, their whole economic model is under threat. They rely heavily on these sectors to generate foreign exchange earnings and often royalty revenues that keep the whole public sector afloat. So they have to worry here about economic diversification to find alternative sources or bases for their economies. To put it starkly, in some of these countries, fossil fuel rents can amount to as much as 30% of GDP. Overcoming a loss of such a magnitude calls for a much bigger way of thinking than just climate finance for solar farms or wind farms. It's about development finance for a whole process of economic diversification that would ensure that these countries remain economically viable during the transition. On top of that, many of these countries are affected by the resource curse caused by the presence of fossil fuels. And that resource curse also limits their abilities and their governance capabilities to actually bring about the kind of economic diversification that is needed. A final special and I think very poignant case are countries that have recently made major fossil fuel discoveries. And there are a number of these in Africa. I'm thinking of places like Mozambique or Senegal, where these fossil fuels are not yet entrenched in their economies, so there isn't a diversification issue yet. However, think about the political challenge of stepping away from such a massive resource bonanza that you've just recently discovered and which is promising a route out of poverty for your country. And so there, I think there's, again, a need for very particular type of support. So in sum, the climate transition is rewriting the energy fortunes of countries. What used to be an asset is becoming a liability. What was never thought about is suddenly a valuable endowment. However, I think in the future that energy fortunes will be less concentrated than they have been in the past. Why? Because renewable energy resources are much more widely dispersed geographically than were the massive fossil fuel deposits that we've relied upon to date. And also the costs and complexity of transporting renewable energy is not quite as straightforward as in the case of fossil fuels. So for some, this might not be a problem because people point to the resource curse and say, well, were these countries really blessed with fossil fuels? Has it really delivered economic development for them? Many would say not. But even if that's true, the short-term adjustment of actually stepping away from these major sources of economic activity is really a very sobering challenge.
Thank you, Vivien. Lots of food for thought for the rest of the discussion. Brenda, I wonder if I can sort of bring you in on this to get a perspective from a decision maker in terms of also looking at how the EU perhaps is considering some of these different circumstances, whether it's within sort of EU member states or in third countries that you might be working with as you look to develop the energy transition plans.
Well, thank you. Yes. It is the policy that we don't have so far, but it's the policy that we will have to develop in the next 3 to 5 years in the European Union, particularly. The European Union is in an inflection point. We are about to have an absolute decline in oil and gas use in all of the scenarios that we ourselves have published, and then all of the scenarios that, for example, the IEA has published. And in the majority of private sector analyses as well, there is going to be a reduction of oil and gas consumption in the European Union. And coal, I should also mention. Across the different sectors, it will be different, of course. There will be different levels of reduction, and whether we are 1.5 degree compliant or 2 degree compliant, these will also have impacts. For example, in the natural gas sector, fossil gas sector, we see a market today of imported gas of about 350 billion cubic meters of gas per year. And we will be down to about 50 billion by 2050 import needs, so a sevenfold reduction in the next 15, 20 years. And that will have huge impacts on the countries that export. It's the same for oil as well, and slightly less aggressive for coal, but that's only because we've already done the work on coal. Mm-hmm. And for some countries, there will be enormous impacts. However, I think one thing that has changed recently is that if I had said 5 years ago, we are going to reduce by 2/3 our gas imports from country A within 2 years, no one would have believed that it was possible. And indeed, policymakers would have been told, no, shut up, go back to looking at academic papers. But in fact, sorry. I said some nice things beforehand, yeah. We do read academic papers and they're very, very helpful. But we would have been told that. But the fact is that in the past 3 years, we have reduced oil and gas imports from our largest exporter from 5 years ago to virtually 2/3 of what it was. So Russia is the country in question. What Russia has shown us is that it can be done. And that is one of the strange outcomes of the Russia crisis, is that with political will, with the right planning and with the right foresight, you can actually do these things. Now, if we look at a country like Algeria, you mentioned Algeria, in all of the scenarios for fossil fuel phase out, Nigeria goes from about $40 billion per year income from oil and gas exports down to about 15 billion by 10 years from now. So a huge reduction in the income that they get, and that's assuming that the prices don't collapse from oversupply. That's at current prices. At the same time, that country has a huge demographic problem. It's going from, I believe, around 45 million people to about 60 million by 2050. So the per capita decline in income will be even greater. And there is a responsibility, I think, on the consumers, particularly the cross-border consumers of oil and gas, to say, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to manage these relationships for the future? There are 4 major consumers globally who import oil, gas, and coal. And if one could align those 4 importers, so those would be the European Union, Japan, Korea, China, and then after that it would probably be India and Turkey. But if you could bring some alignment to the perspective of those countries about how to deal with the just transition, we could also deal with some of the offsets that are coming into policy terms. And we see in the European Union 4 paradigms, 4 heuristics for the fossil fuel phase-out that we need to take into account in policy terms. The first is price. That will be the default paradigm if we do nothing. But the problem with the price paradigm is that by 2030 for the European Union, our marginal suppliers will be all OPEC countries, and there will be an extremely concentrated supply risk for marginal suppliers of oil and gas. If we took another paradigm, emissions in the supply chain, which is the currently adopted paradigm for the European Union, we see an early restriction on some of the countries which have the least capacity to deal with the transition. So high emissions in the what's called the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions of the delivery of oil and gas and coal to the European Union has impact on some of the poorest countries like Libya, Algeria, Iraq, all of those types of countries around the periphery of the European Union, and which poses new challenges for us. What Russia has also told us is that we need a security paradigm as well. But the security paradigm is not fully fleshed out, and we don't know, for example, what the future relationship is between the European Union and some of the countries that currently supply us. There have in the past been, for example, US restrictions on oil and gas exports for domestic energy purposes. Is that a security issue for us? Norway is a concentrated supply risk as well. So those are things that we need to think about. And then there is the role of just transition, and that's the last paradigm that I want to put on the table. How do we deal with the just transition? Do we, as the European Union, want to give our last euro to Norway, or would there be a more worthy country to give that money to in Africa or South America?
Thank you. Again, lots of great points, and again, emphasis on the fact that there's, particularly for countries that need to undergo both an energy and an economic transition, that there's need to be particular care. And I guess picking up on your point around the fact that this requires perhaps like a broader thinking from the international community around how do you support those countries. I'd be keen to dive into perhaps like some of the challenges on the ground in terms of channeling finance towards clean energy projects and facilitating some of these shifts away from fossil fuels. Because we know from the International Energy Agency also just earlier this month that despite the fact that the world is seeing an unprecedented level of investments in clean energy this year, there continue to be major imbalances. And in fact, emerging market and developing economies outside of China have only seen about 15% of global energy spending. So if we dive into perhaps some of the barriers that are holding back capital flows, Harry, could you comment on some of the challenges that countries that you're working with at the EBRD are facing? And where do you see, as now they need to prepare for their next round of national climate plans, where do you see the need for really stepping up action?
Sure, thank you, Caterina. Let me just first thank the Natural History Museum. I'm the father of one of the museum's most devoted visitors. I won't say that I've seen all 80 million objects, but it has at times felt like that. But it's very special to be here. It's a wonderful, wonderful institution. So, you know, as you mentioned, part of my job is to go out to lots of countries that we work in, the 34 or so developing markets we work in, and try to persuade them to get on board the energy transition train. And that ought to be a pretty easy job. And partly because of the points that Vivien and Brendan really made, that ultimately the energy transition is a good news story. You're moving to a cheaper, cleaner, more reliable, much more dispersed, much less risky form of energy. It also is going to give you clean air. It's also going to give you new sorts of jobs. So it ought to be a good story. But it's a hard story to sell. And countries are not getting on that train as fast as they should do. And if you ask why, well, actually a lot of the reasons it doesn't happen as fast as you want in emerging markets are the same reasons it doesn't happen as fast as it should do in developed markets. You know, the UK is an energy superpower. And it's not, despite what some people think, North Sea oil. It's northern wind. You know, it's a very, very windy country. Some of the best wind resources onshore and offshore in the world. Why are we not, you know, dramatically exploiting that? Why are we not rolling out electric vehicles fueled by Scottish wind, you know, as fast as possible? Well, because of the reasons that afflict all of these countries. Vested interests. You know, it is a political economy question, and there are always losers in this transition. And typically those losers are in the old energy paradigm, and the old energy paradigm is enormously powerful. So you have vested interests. You have upfront costs. The energy transition is very capital intensive. You have to spend a lot of money up front to build all of this stuff. You don't have to spend very much money after that because the fuel is free and the operating costs are trivial. But you do have to spend a lot of money up front, and that creates a barrier. And then thirdly, it's just a question of stickiness, of institutional stickiness. You need to do a lot of planning. You need to do a lot of selling, of presenting, of explaining. And that's hard. It's really difficult, and it's easy to be derailed. Those three reasons are also prevalent in the same markets we're in. You know, all of those things exist. But then you've also got a couple more problems. One is you have weaker institutional capacity. You know, it's a trope of developing countries that they have less resource, less governmental resource. And I can tell you that very directly, very personally. You sit with often fantastic ministers or fantastic civil servants in countries, every bit as talented, every bit as dedicated, if not more, than their counterparts in developed countries. But there's no machine. You know, they pull a lever and nothing happens because they don't have the same depth of governmental resource. And that is a really fundamental challenge. And so that's one big issue. Second big issue is access to capital. You know, it is harder for developing markets to access capital, and it's often more expensive particularly because so many of them now are very fiscally constrained because of the responses to the shocks in the last few years. And the third reason, which is related to that, is an absence of domestic capital. So the UK can essentially fund its energy transition by borrowing pounds. The EU can fund it by borrowing euros. But developing countries typically can't do that. They don't have enough domestic currency to meet, they don't have enough domestic savings, and they don't have the depth and long-term position of their domestic capital markets. And when they try to borrow foreign exchange, they don't have the ability to hedge that risk. So they expose themselves to very significant risks around currency volatility. So you take all of the problems that people living in the UK or people living in the European Union can identify in their own political experience, and then you add a few more, and those are the reasons why an obviously sensible thing doesn't happen, or doesn't happen as fast as it should.
Thank you. And picking up on some of the challenges that Terry mentioned, but also perhaps commenting on your engagement with private sector, Rebecca, what are the challenges that they are facing and that they're sort of sharing with you? And I guess looking ahead at the NDCs, what would they want to see in those NDCs to make sure that they can actually address some of these challenges and sort of guide their investments going forward?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's great to have heard the sort of, Scope 3 supply chain bits picked up and the sort of economic diversification, because at the end of the day, it's actually the businesses in the economy that are actually going to have to do that. And provide the solutions, provide and deploy the solutions. So the kind of role of the high-level climate champion every year within the COP is to mobilize non-state actors, and that's literally everyone from the sort of private finance to higher education and everyone else, but business is a large piece of that but when we talk about business in the private sector, who actually is that, right? Traditionally, it's been large companies with a lot of resources and that operate in lots of different jurisdictions that can bring a certain view and that have been the target. But actually this year, part of our work is really to bring in the piece that isn't being brought in around SMEs. They face a very different set of challenges. When we talk about renewable energy access and procurement, they can't be signing PPAs and things to access it from a demand side. And so that's 90% of businesses, 50% more or less usually of GDP, and 80% of employment is SMEs. And so how are we bringing them along is one of the questions that we have this year, as well as climate solutions and the access to finance piece is where, renewables is at a certain phase, but when we're looking at energy efficiency solutions or, hydrogen or other solutions, they don't have the sort of revenue track record and things like that you need to make something bankable, to be able to get the finance and the access. So that's a huge challenge there, where the policy environment can provide that long-term stability that they need to be able to do that. And so, and then another large challenge that no one seems to talk about enough is skills. We talk about this wonderful new green economy being a huge creator of jobs, and that is true at a macro level. But on the ground, actually, finance is limiting things, but access to the right people who can actually do it. And most people are not going to get these new skills in higher education, in school. They're going to have to learn on the job while they're doing something else. And where are they going to be resprayed? Where are these jobs? They might not be in the same place. So when we talk about the just transition at a macro level of where is money going, across the world, it also works on a really practical, day-to-day level. It's people, and it's happening, in communities and things like that. So, and businesses are literally at the forefront of that, having to manage these things. And it's one of many other things that they have to sort of deal with every day. So that's when we talk about who are we talking about when we talk about business, there's a huge range there. But then in terms of what we're asking them, we've focused a lot on kind of the energy. When we talk about the energy system, we talk a lot about the supply side, right? And we're talking about the story of reducing the use of fossil fuels, essentially. We don't necessarily focus enough on the demand side. And the stickiness point is one that we also look at. So when you're talking about, you can decide to procure renewable electricity. You can decide tomorrow that it's, when your contract's up, that it's too expensive or you don't want to. That's not sort of sticky demand. But as we shift some of the whether it's buildings or transport or heavy industry, if we can electrify those, and if we can, move those to sort of clean energy solutions, that's sticky demand, right? That will actually reduce long-term the demand for fossil fuels. So, when we talk, I think there's sort of a bit of a call to look at focusing on what we're moving towards and the solutions, and that opportunity is part of what we're trying to look at this year. in particular. And yeah, sort of how can we bring the demand side in more as part of the conversation? But then on the NDCs, I think the main thing, for many years, I think a lot of the policy conversation was how can we incentivize and get better deployment and come in and to get more deployment of renewables. Whereas now the economics mean that essentially in a lot of countries it's how can they get out of the way, whether it's essentially fossil fuel subsidies creating a negative carbon price that means that the economics aren't actually as competitive as they could be, or really making sure that the grid infrastructure is there. And then, the developers will come. It makes sense, right? But the NDCs are a really specific point that we're in where, businesses think in business cycles, which are roughly 10 years, right? These NDCs are going to set out the policy landscape for the next 10 years. And how can they be used to not just do the high-level signaling that's required, but what's needed is the granularity. How does it dock into all the other policy instruments, all the other parts of, of policy land and regulation that actually affects business decision-making? Because NDCs up here don't, but how it affects individual regulations and things, that actually does affect business decision-making. And the one thing that I haven't heard at all, despite the fact that I'm absolutely melting up here, is adaptation and resilience.
If I can pose you there, because we're going to have a panel around that following this one. But lots of great points also around sort of providing more granular information and sort of guidance in the NDCs around also planning skills and addressing both the supply and demand side of the energy systems. We're going to move to questions in a minute, but I'm keen to just address the point around sort of how the international community really needs to come together to support countries to drive forward this agenda. And this is both giving confidence that finance will flow, but also in terms of setting the high bar for what those NDCs will look like. And I will ask two questions, one to Brendan and one to Harry, and if I can ask you to be as succinct as possible. The first to Brendan, I think following COP28, there have been some countries that certainly have come forward suggesting different interpretations of the energy commitments in the global stocktake, suggesting perhaps that they are optional and they don't apply to all countries. And in a way, obviously, the spotlight will be on major economies and what they decide to do with their NDCs. And with that in mind, the question to you is sort of how is the EU looking to raise ambition on this topic? And perhaps what would you hope to see also from major economies, G7, G20 leaders, to really set that high bar?
I could give you a very short answer, which is thank you. But I guess I have to go slightly further than that. I mean, the G20 is meeting now, actually, I think in Brussels as we speak. The G7 and the G20 groups are mechanisms for forming opinions which develop over the year and come to fruition at COP. I think from the perspective that I have, which is the European Commission, DG Energy, the thing that is needed for the future is the mechanisms for finance. And it's the intermediate finance, not the high-level numbers, 100 billion this and 100 billion that. It's mezzanine financing, it's first risk or de-risking. It's things like that, particularly with countries which includes some member states of the European Union, which have difficulty accessing relatively good financial terms. And there is a real intermediate lack of there's financing for projects, there's financing, but there is no mechanism, I find, for things like first loss in new projects, mezzanine financing particularly. We would love to see those types of things come forward and then link them very much to renewables projects. Just shortly, the interesting thing about the past was that oil and gas companies managed to do this. The question for the future is, will the renewables and the electricity sector be able to adapt those skills that we had in the past and apply them to new projects which can bring the Saharan resources in solar together with the European Union developments in consumption?
Thank you. And Harry, again, sort of looking at the international community, there will be discussions certainly in the last panel today around the negotiations around the new collective quantified goal later this year at COP29. But there's also been calls for sort of reforming the broader international financial system. And there have been steps from the World Bank and multilateral development banks to sort of boost lending. But at least there's some voices that would want that those reforms to move much more quickly. And perhaps there's a question to you as to where do you see opportunities to really boost sources of innovative public finance? And again, what would you like to see maybe from G7 and G20 leaders to really fast-track this set of reforms?
Well, the two-word answer is a capital increase. No, I mean, so I think, firstly, there has to be, I'll start with a sort of defensive posture, because MDB reform is a hot topic, and, you know, MDBs get very defensive because that's our nature. You know, there is some of this debate is informed by misunderstanding of what development banks can do. Development banks are banks. We do not have a mandate from our shareholders to lose money. In fact, we don't have a mandate to even lose a AAA rating. So sometimes people say development bank, there's a fiscal crisis, you know, there's a debt crisis for many emerging markets. And people say, development banks, you should forgive all the debt. Sure, we can do that, but then we're not going to lend anything the next day. So, and our shareholders don't want us to do that. So in practice, we can't do that. They also say, the cost of capital is too high. Lend at a very low cost. We can't do that. If you lend below the cost, you will lose money. You will erode your capital base. So there's some degree of unrealism, because people look at development banks, which are well-resourced, well-capitalized institutions, and think, great, there's a pot of money there, we can do something better. But as I say, we're banks, and that limits the range of maneuver. So and I think that is a quite fundamental point. And you know, we are not a substitute for grant or concessional flows from developed to developing, which is fundamental to any form of just climate settlement. And what can we do? We can do more with what we have. Okay, we have been put under a lot of pressure to use our balance sheets more flexibly, and we are trying to do that. And in particular, the World Bank is growing its lending capacity. In EBRD's case, we'd already taken a number of those steps, and we're not currently capital constrained. But there's no doubt the system as a whole can increase its lending capacity. But it can't increase it at, you know, by the order of magnitude that's required. We can be more collaborative. You know, surprise, surprise, development banks do have some competitive streak. And actually, sometimes that's good, but a lot of time it inhibits our effectiveness. So we are working on mechanisms to make ourselves more collaborative. But the most fundamental thing is we do need collectively to focus on mobilizing the private sector. And that does not come easily or naturally, because we are typically engaged with the public sector. Most development banks lend largely to the public sector or exclusively to the public sector. Look at the volume of finance you need. You need something like 2.4 trillion, if you take the Songway-Stern report, 2.4 trillion annually in lower middle-income countries by 2030. Development banks currently lend about 100 billion for climate, right? There's no plausible way where that 100 reaches 2.4. It doesn't get close to it. The one scalable pot of capital there is private money. There's more than enough private money. So I think the biggest shift for development banks has to be to multiply the private sector leverage dramatically.
Thank you. I'm very conscious of time. I'm going to try and take two questions from the audience, but please, I'm going to shut you down after 30 seconds. So if you can raise your hands So we're going to take one here in the front and one, the lady in the back there.
Yeah, Brandmayr from E3G. A question maybe for Rebecca and then the others to comment on. How do we get the culture of radical collaboration that we see in the Climate Champions team, the Race to Zero, the Race to Resilience, into the national leaders? How do we avoid the finger pointing saying your end of the lifeboat is sinking, which I see attending the climate negotiations for 30 years now. We need a culture change transmitted up from the subnationals, business, investors, states and cities to the national level. Any thoughts of how we do that?
Perfect. And we're going to take the second question right away. And then I'm going to ask the speakers to reflect on those and wrap up.
Thanks, Ritwika Sengupta from British Standards Institute. I'm really interested to hear from the panel on if you see a risk to the cooperation that you're talking about for the energy system that's needed from the kind of security focus of many nations. So there's a lot of research to show that job security, economic security, energy security, and a national focus is becoming more prominent. Do you see that as a risk to delivering a global energy transition? Thank you.
Thank you. So I might ask Rebecca if you want to go first, and then we'll just go across the panel for any also closing remarks, and if you can keep it to 1 minute.
Yes, I'll be very brief. The part of what we're trying to do is to work out how we can plug that sort of radical collaboration approach and plug it more directly into parties and governments, right? And so we have initiatives like CHAMP, which was a sort of multi-level governance initiative that came out of the last COP, which is about how do you get the subnational governments and cities more structurally to interface with and input into national planning, and in response also get more local budget and things at that level. But it's and I think it ties to the other question around the security and how there's that sort of competing interest there. I think as things get, my personal opinion is, honestly, as things get worse, people will just realise that they have to, that they just have to come to the table together, and it's because it's in everyone's interest. But yeah, a great question that we ask ourselves as well.
Thank you. Does anyone want to respond to those questions?
Well, on the first one, I mean, I think this is selling it as an opportunity. Recognizing, getting away from this sort of sense of this is all a cost. Of course, there are significant costs. Of course, there's huge disruption. But the end goal, I mean, this is a good place to be in. A wind and solar fueled world, which is at a first order approximation, is what the energy transition is a good place to be, a better place to be than we currently are. And so, the more people recognize that it's not a zero-sum game, the better. Just on the trade question, I mean, yes, huge issue because you have a concentration of the cheapest, sometimes the only and often the best supplier in one location. And I'm especially interested in Brendan's answer to that question.
So I'm going to come to Brendan now, and then Vivien, if you also want to give some just closing remarks as like key messages to take away in the lead up to COP. Brendan.
To the question from the lady back there. It's very difficult. I think what I have limited exposure to climate discussions, but when I have seen companies work fastest and quickest is when you have a direct relationship between the policy and their profits. And for me, the only policies that work are policies which have a direct feed through to the economic sustainability of the companies involved, and international obligations which are related to a theory of change which is related to that issue are effective, and those that are not related to that profitability issue do not have any impact.
Thank you. And Vivien, any last thoughts?
Sure. Just to reflect briefly on the implications for the international community to support countries in the Global South through the transition. I think I'd like to mention that there's a need for larger scale, more programmatic approaches that look beyond just climate finance to looking at supporting economic diversification. I think the JETP is an interesting development that moves into that direction, but still with many unresolved issues and questions in terms of how it's going to work and so on. And then finally, to address some of the issues that Harry was alluding to, we're working increasingly on an approach called data to deal, which provides integrated technical assistance and capacity building to countries all the way from upstream planning through to unlocking different sources of finance. Our work suggests that the climate transition as currently posed is not affordable for many countries, and so there's a need to close the climate financing gap, probably through a mixture of more concessional finance or better energy prices in the developing world, and finding an equitable balance between those two approaches. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for your great insights and contribution. And no doubt some of these topics will also be picked up in the panels later in the day. We're going to move on now to the panel on adaptation. But before that, if you can please join me in thanking the speakers for their insights.